Hello. Hi. This is quite a it's quite a complicated subject, and you are a distinguished audience who I know some of you by reputation, like Simon Chauvel, and I know others, Andrew Walker, Missy Liebler, and people, and I know how knowledgeable you are. So I'll try and pitch this right, so that I get it about right, not too much detail, not too little. And what I suggest I do is just outline some points about how bad the media is, which I put to you is worse than we think, even worse than we think it is. And then also some suggestions for how Israeli public relations might be improved. And then I think it's always more productive to have questions and answers, have plenty of time for that, although I would say that let's keep them to relatively short questions or points. So I'll just make some different observations first of all. In no particular order. I'm going to start by showing you a few things. I'm going to start with something from the BBC. Some of you who are on my email list might have seen these things already because I already sent them out on my list. The BBC, as you know, is the world's biggest news broadcaster. It broadcasts in about 30 languages, on the radio, online, in television. It has a 24-hour Arabic television station as well as a radio station. It also has now BBC Persian, which was set up about a year or so ago. BBC Persian is meant to be putting forth let's not say pro-Western views, but let's say alternatives to what the Iranian government puts forth. So this, for example, is the story which I'm sure you're all familiar with about Israelis supposedly harvesting Palestinian organs from BBC Persian, which I have complained about directly to the Director General through somebody who I know is very close to him, and yet the story remains up on their website now. It's from December. The point is, this is still live on BBC Persian website. This is meant to put pro-democracy views. This story is about Israel supposedly, or Israeli government policies supposedly harvesting Palestinian organs. That photo is not from the Middle East. That is a file photo from a hospital in London. The worst accusations that were made is that one doctor 15 years ago took some skin grafts of dead Israeli citizens, some of which are Arab Israelis. Besides the fact it's barely a relevant story for today and it's barely breaking news, the picture alone completely distorts what this story is about. Now, this is a British government-funded website to put, not to repeat the kind of stuff we might expect on Iranian government websites, but to put a pro-British point of view. Now, the Director General, who's the head of the BBC, is aware of this web page. I know because I've been involved in private correspondence with him through somebody else who's very senior in British society. The Director General of the BBC is not an enemy of Israel. His wife is Jewish. He would regard himself as a friend of Israel, and yet he doesn't see any problem in leaving this photo. I've asked him at least to remove the photo, if not the story. It is still online, as we can see, because this is live internet footage. I'll give you some other examples. I'm from Britain originally, although I write for American newspapers, so I tend to focus on British media, but I would say that I think the British media is probably the most significant in the world, certainly as far as Israel is concerned. That's partly because the British media is a global media. The BBC is a global television and radio service, and other news media out of Britain, their impact is bigger outside of Britain than inside of Britain. For example, The Economist magazine, President Clinton said it's his first choice of news every week. The Financial Times sells more copies outside of Britain than inside of Britain. It's printed also in Frankfurt and Hong Kong and New York. Reuters news agency is originally a British news agency. It does have it's jointly headquartered now in New York and London, but it's still primarily British, and it's the second biggest news agency in the world. And then you have other media like Sky News and so on. So here's the Financial Times, which I just mentioned, from last June. This is in the period of the Iranian protests following the disputed election. So, as I'm sure you all know, there was this young woman shot called Neda, who's become a symbol of the Iranian pro-democracy protests, and she was shot dead. She wasn't actually in a protest, she was just shot dead. So here she is. The Financial Times doesn't tend to do that much non-economic front page news, but here we are on the front page. The headline is "Student Who Became Iran's Angel of Freedom." But the first paragraph on page 1 reads as follows. The footage of a Palestinian man being shot dead next to his 12-year-old son by Israeli forces in Gaza in 2000 is etched in the minds of many Iranians as state televisions continually replayed the Zionist regime's brutality, etc., etc. In other words, they're talking about Mohammed al-Dura, which is a controversy in and of itself. But before I even get to al-Dura, the fact is, the one and only time the Financial Times is giving a front page story to Iranian protesters, it's starting with Israel and al-Dura and an incident 9 years earlier, which itself is controversial over whether Israel had anything to do with al-Dura's death, and indeed some people think that he in fact isn't dead, but many people think that even if he is dead, he was more likely killed by Palestinian gunfire. But in any case, it's entirely irrelevant to this story, and certainly not in the first opening sentence of the front page story. I'm just outlining some of the problems here before I get to some suggestions. Here's the Herald Tribune from last week. As you know, the Herald Tribune is owned by the New York Times. It says on its masthead at the top, now, it didn't used to say this, the global edition of the New York Times. It's also printed in various locations around the world and has certain influence. This is not from the foreign news page. This is from the media, business and technology section. Okay? So here we have something about football and the African Nations Cup, about the media coverage. Here we have something about Rupert Murdoch and Roger Ailes, who's the CEO of Fox News. And here, and I knew before looking at the caption which country it was going to be about, at the top of the page, we have this photo, and I knew it's going to be Gaza. Here it says Gaza in 1956. They're now talking about the supposed massacre in 1956, because they ran out of stories about 2008, 2009. This is not the foreign news section of the paper. This is the second page of the business section of the newspaper. Again, I'm just outlining how some of the coverage of Israel is crept into all kinds of places that's not necessarily an obvious place, like Iran coverage, like the business coverage. Times of London the other day had a review of the new movie by the Coen brothers. You probably heard about it. It's said to be their most Jewish film. In the headline, it's in the weekend section of the London Times, which is a kind of centrist newspaper. It's not known for, having particularly punchy or radical opinions. In the review headline, it linked the Coen brothers' new film, which is an American Jewish filmmakers, with Gaza. Okay, there is no relevance to that movie. It is completely unheard of in the cultural section to do that. I've never seen it done before about movies from any other country. They don't mention, I don't know, Chechnya when talking about some Russian film that's got nothing to do with that. I mean, this wasn't even an Israeli film anyway. It's a film by two American Jewish filmmakers. A lot of people think the problem comes either from Arabs or Muslims, states or lobbies in the West, or they think it comes from the hard left. It does come from both those groups, but it's now spread much beyond that. So my own paper that I used to write for here, the Telegraph, which is a right-of-centre British paper, I'll show you one cartoon from there, just to show you it's not limited just to the hard left. Okay, this was from a couple of years ago. This is from my own website. I wrote that caption. So essentially, it's a Holocaust comparison. The print of. So you can see that it says Warsaw 1943, Tyre 2006. It's a direct comparison between the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and South Lebanon in 2006. The significance, besides being horrible, the real significance is this was a cartoon in the Daily Telegraph, Britain's best-selling quality newspaper, and it's a paper that's traditionally sympathetic to Israel. It was owned until recently by Conrad Black, who also owned the Jerusalem Post and is self-proclaimed Zionist. So even in a paper that's owned by somebody that's a keen supporter of Israel, although he didn't own it by then, but it's open season among news editors and the cartoonists and so on. Some of you are familiar with this, but before I stop outlining what's some of the examples, I'll just show you other examples from some of the other European media. First of all, and I know Manfred has shown this cartoon before, this is from Norway. This is Olmert as Amnon Gert in Schindler's List shooting, and we know this because the cartoonist said it. It's meant to be the image from Schindler's List where Ralph Fiennes playing Gert shoots inmates of the concentration camp. That's from Norway. This is from a few years ago in Spain, but you still have this kind of stuff. I've written the caption, it's from my own website. There you have Ariel Sharon wearing a skull cap, which obviously he doesn't normally or didn't. You have swastika in the Star of David, and the caption says in Spanish, "At least Hitler taught me how to invade a country and destroy every living insect." So this again is in a mainstream Spanish paper. We're not talking peripheral here. Okay, the first cartoon is from Greece. In case you can't read it at the back, the caption is, "Israeli soldier, don't feel guilty, brother. We were not in Auschwitz and Dachau to suffer, but to learn." You have a Star of David on the Israeli soldiers who are dressed as kind of Nazis. Beneath that is La Stampa in Italy. Here you have a kind of Christian anti-Semitism, baby Jesus, surely they don't want to kill me again. So it's as though Israel is going to kill Jesus, a big Israeli tank. And the last one's also from Greece. The caption is, "War machine of Sharon is attempting a new Holocaust, a new genocide." Now, these are from 2002, so it's already 8 years ago. So some of the cartoons I showed were from 2007, 8, and 9. In other words, this isn't new. This has been going on for some time. But the situation's getting worse. And one of the reasons it's getting worse is because Israeli public diplomacy has not been effective enough. First of all, I just want to say that it's obviously not Israel's fault that Israel is subjected to impossibly high standards among some in the media and NGOs and governments, and it's obviously not Israel's fault that it's subjected to blatant anti-Semitism like this. Nevertheless, some of the mishandling of journalists and the media and so on has contributed to an atmosphere which manifests itself in all kinds of ways and is obviously unhelpful to the state of Israel and is unhelpful to peace efforts in general, because it's not exactly conducive to making people want to have concessions and trust the other side, and it also fuels Palestinian maximalist desires to think that the world hates Israel and Israel can be destroyed and so on. Israel can produce good spokespeople. We know that. Mr. Cheval, who's here, is a good one. The present Prime Minister and the present President of Israel although they both have different styles and slightly different opinions, they're both good spokespeople. Peres and Netanyahu are both good on television. The minimum standard for any spokesperson should be Peres or Netanyahu, and yet they're probably the two best ones. And there have been other good ones like Danny Gillerman, for example, but there shouldn't be a single person who's a spokesperson for Israel who's not on that standard. In other countries, some spokespeople are not good, but they can afford not to have top-notch people. Israel can't afford it, as we see by the level of animosity to Israel in the international community. One of the structural problems for Israeli Hasbara, Israeli PR, is that very, very few people working in it have any experience in the media. In, for example, the United States and Britain, the senior PR people or spokespeople come out of the media. They understand how to deal with the media. They understand how to manipulate the media, because the media themselves are not honest. The journalists are a product of their own upbringings and the societies they grew up in. And I sometimes say the media are kind of a mass of emotion and prejudice, and there are very, very few journalists who are genuinely managed to be objective, especially in a conflict like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is very emotive and emotional conflict. Occasionally you get journalists that are overly sympathetic to Israel. Usually you get journalists which are overly sympathetic to the Palestinians. In any case, if you look, for example, in the United States, for example, Tony Snow, who was Bush's spokesperson, he had worked at CNN and then Fox News. In Britain, Alistair Campbell, who was closest to Tony Blair, had been, I think it was the foreign editor of the Daily Mirror, which is a tabloid yellow paper, but he knew how to deal with the media. He knows how the little nuances and how they work. Every person I've ever met who's at the Israeli Foreign Ministry, who deals with Hasbara, public diplomacy, does not understand the media, but they think they understand the media, and they are somewhat arrogant to listen to anyone who does understand the media. So you have a kind of lethal cocktail of thinking they're good when they're not good, and they may be intelligent and good at other things, but they don't understand how complex the media is. The media is as complex. I mean, just because we consume news, we watch news, we read newspapers, a lot of people think they understand how a newsroom works, or how news actually arrives from person A to the broadcast, or how a television footage is put together. And it's actually a very, very complicated matter. So it will be like, some of the things I've heard from some Israeli diplomats will be the equivalent of me saying, I've watched a couple of James Bond films, so now I can be the head of the Mossad. I mean, you have to, it's a very, very complicated matter, what the media is and how to deal with it. Now, a lot of people in the foreign ministry and elsewhere complain about things like lack of resources. They say they need more money. Of course, money is helpful, but that's a distraction from the real problem. What they need is some good people, first and foremost, who really understand the media. I'm not just talking about spokespeople, but I'm talking about people who understand all the relationships, the nuances. They'll understand that in a single given paper, like, for example, the Times of London, which I mentioned before, which is turning from being relatively fair or sympathetic to Israel to being sharply critical of Israel. It's in the Saturday weekend section, I think, is in the Saturday edition is in, I think, 11 or 12 sections now. So each section has a different editor, a different photo editor, a different person doing headlines. The chief editor of the Times won't even know what's in the Times magazine until it arrives on his breakfast table. There are all kinds of different structures. You also, and I don't want to go into too much detail, but there's a whole set of familial relationships. So, for example, with the Times, the present editor is their first ever Jewish editor. He was previously married to an Israeli journalist, had a quite nasty divorce about 2 years ago, and while I don't want to speculate as a psychologist, the Times sharply turned against Israel following this period. And, and I'll give you one example. There are thousands of examples in the media of different relationships, who's married to who's having affairs with who has children by who might even be an ex-Israeli, who might have converted to Islam, and so on. It's a huge battlefield which the state of Israel hasn't even begun to approach. They have no idea. Every single person I've spoken to, including quite senior people, don't have any idea just how complicated it is. Then there is pure clumsiness and ineptitude. I'll give you two examples, although I'd ask you not, if anybody's a journalist, not to write about them for a matter of confidence for the people who told me this. The first example is with the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera. You may be aware that in the Gaza war a year ago, they were probably the only newspaper in the world whose correspondent went to the hospitals of Gaza, interviewed injured people, and said, hey, these people are not civilians. He actually interviewed them, and they admitted to being members of Islamic Jihad and so on, and he catalogued this in quite a detailed way that a lot of people that encountered as civilians were indeed not civilians. Corriere is one of the two big Italian newspapers. It's on the centre-right. It's close to Berlusconi, who's essentially a friend of Israel. They asked for an interview with Netanyahu when Netanyahu came to office. They are a newspaper that's a friendly newspaper. Netanyahu's office said yes. They prepared for this interview. They left the space available and so on. Then at the last minute, they were told you'd be doubled up with Paris Match. Paris Match is a glossy magazine that has, photos of, Mrs. Sarkozy on the beach and so on. And from Corriere's point of view, it's slightly insulting to be paired up with Paris Match. Then Bibi had an eye problem that day, so he cancelled both the interviews, but then he rescheduled the interview only with Paris Match, because the owner, or somebody who's close to the owner, is some possible donor to the Likud, or in any way he's got some connection, the French owner, with Netanyahu. Then, so Corriere, who still wanted an interview, and they felt slighted by the fact, and they'd left space, and they'd announced it already in the paper that it was going to run the next day. Then Bibi was going to Italy to meet with Berlusconi, so Netanyahu's office said that the correspondent could fly with Netanyahu on the plane and maybe grab a couple of minutes with him on the plane. He turns up at the airport. They say, we want $900 for your fee. He says, okay, here's a credit card. They say, sorry, we don't take credit. Well, they didn't say sorry. They said, we don't take credit card. We want cash. He says, well, I don't have $900 in cash. This is to the most favourable newspaper in Europe. Okay. Anyway. Then they say, okay, you can pay afterwards. He flies. Netanyahu anyway doesn't have time to speak to him. Then on the return, some fairly low official at the Prime Minister's office making a fuss about the payment, and again says, we want cash, and they say we want to wire it. And then a particular person at the Prime Minister's office says, the State of Israel is going to sue Corriere della Sera if we're not paid by 4 this afternoon. So again, we're talking about the most sympathetic newspaper probably in Europe right now to Israel. These are fairly lowly officials, but the point is, nobody like this should be employed by the Prime Minister's office, or they should be sacked. Again, I don't want to go into it. They are aware of it. I've spoken to people in the Prime Minister's office about it. Another example, about November 1st last year, well, about 5 days earlier than that, Erdogan, the Turkish Prime Minister, on a visit to Iran, said that Avigdor Lieberman had said that Israel should drop a nuclear bomb on Gaza. This wasn't really picked up by anyone, no one took it very seriously, but 5 days later, The Guardian, British newspaper The Guardian, did rewrite it out of context at the top of the page in a way that could do real damage. And I was interested, first of all, if he'd even... first of all, I wanted to make sure that Lieberman hadn't said that. This was on a Friday. So I have the private cell phones of all 3 senior advisors to Lieberman, his chief of staff, and so on. None of them answered the phone or got back to me. Then I phoned someone in the Prime Minister's office who was driving his kids, and he said he couldn't speak. So then I spoke to someone in the Foreign Ministry who said, well, no, who gave a rational answer, but a rational answer is not what's required. What's required is an outright denial that Lieberman said any such thing, and in any case Israel doesn't even admit to having any nuclear weapons. So that should be the denial. Instead, he's being rational. He's saying, well, why would Israel drop a nuclear bomb on Gaza? If we dropped a nuclear bomb on Gaza, we would also contaminate or, affect people in Ashkelon and Beersheba and so on. For people abroad, they don't care about the geography. They don't know the geography. That's the first and foremost thing is just to deny it. He said that he didn't feel comfortable denying it. It's a British newspaper. It has to come from the embassy in London. I had to phone Ron Prosser, who's the ambassador there, about something else. I phoned him anyway, but he had just taken off from New York, so he was going to be out of phone reach for 7 hours. Then it transpired, when I spoke to other people at the embassy, that there had been no press secretary or head of the Department of Public Affairs from early August until the end of October because of internal politics of the Foreign Ministry. In other words, through all the time that the Goldstone report was released, the embassy in London, which from a media point of view is maybe the most significant embassy in the world because of what I mentioned, the BBC and so on, they didn't even have a press spokesperson or a head of the Department of Public Affairs. Anyway, I spoke to the new press spokesperson. It was his second day on the job. He was very nervous to do anything when his ambassador was unreachable. So then it was getting to Friday afternoon. The people here had, gone off for the weekend and so on. So no denial was ever made. Now, to date, this story hasn't actually spread. But 2 years earlier, there was a similar incident on a Friday where Vilnai, who I think was then Deputy Defence Minister, had been mistranslated as the comments he made about Hashoah and Shoah in Gaza, and it was all over the world through Reuters and so on that Israel wants to create a Holocaust in Gaza. And this also happened on a Friday where government officials had gone home, essentially. And I said to the people here, look, it's going to spread, even if it's just on Wikipedia or something, it becomes a fact that Lieberman said, let's nuke Gaza. And you have to deny it right now. Anyway, the denial wasn't done. The reason I'm telling you this is it's just sheer incompetence. This isn't about understanding the media. This is mismanagement, having too many players not coordinating with each other. You have here a government press office. The Prime Minister's office has a department. You have the Foreign Ministry, you have a Foreign Minister and a Deputy Foreign Minister, both with their own staffs, their own spokespeople, their own media advisors. So there's a general lack of coordination. Now, there are some things that can be done which are very, very simple, and people don't do them. So, for example, Gaza, okay? These photos I located through an Arab friend of mine on Hamas's own website from the end of November 26th last year, of the Eid celebrations in Gaza. I'll just scroll down, but the point why I'm showing you this is life looks okay there compared to some of the images of calling it a concentration camp and so on, so on and so on. This is from Hamas's own website, and you can see the date at the top. It's, I think, the 26th of November last year. That last cow, I'm told, is an Angus cow, which is the most expensive and good quality meat. Without getting into the rights and wrongs of Israeli policy or Egyptian or international policy towards Gaza, these photos in and of themselves tell a very, very different story from what we see, for example, in the Herald Tribune. Okay? At best, both these stories are right. In other words, there are bits of Gaza which were destroyed in Israeli air raids, but the idea that people are starving or that life is so terrible is belied by photos from Hamas's own website. It's not, the foreign ministry or whoever doesn't need a big budget to disseminate such photos. It's there free on Hamas's own website. I'll show you something else as well. Lauren Booth, who's a British journalist, and she's also the sister-in-law of Tony Blair, but she's a journalist for the Mail on Sunday, which is a Sunday newspaper in the centre. It's not a left or right paper. She directly compared Gaza to a concentration camp, and then 5 days later, Getty Images, which is a news agency, released some photos of her in Gaza. This is 5 days after she compared it with Dachau. That's her shopping in Gaza. That's her being awarded her honorary Palestinian passport. Besides the fact it's blatant bias, she's actually getting a Palestinian passport where she's a registered journalist for a British newspaper, and she should be more tactful as a close relation of Tony Blair. I mean, words fail me, and I'm sure they fail everyone, for someone to suggest that it's a concentration camp and then happily go shopping, you know, in a shop which wouldn't be out of place in, you know, Beverly Hills and some local convenience store. So I'm just bouncing around ideas here about what can be done to make things better, and how easy some of the things are very, very complex and very difficult to do, and it's almost a civilizational battle of which Israel is a political football between East and West. But some of the things are very, very simple. Most of the people who are critical of Israel or opposed to Israel in the West are not outright ideologues. They're ordinary people who've seen pictures day after day of dead Palestinian children and will be inhuman not to be sympathetic to those children, and they think that is the beginning and the end of the story of what's happening in Gaza. How long have I spoken for? I tell you what, I have some other points, but why don't we, I don't like having just my own voice all the time. Why don't we have, if anyone's got some, a few questions, and if you don't, I can speak some more. Okay.
Frida Tiet first, Abner Fall second, Salman Shoval, Bill Fishman,
Sybil Kaplan.
Thank you for all your comments. It's very familiar to me because I've been involved in this kind of hasbara for a very long time. And I have two basic suggestions to make, if I may, very briefly. Every name that you've mentioned, every person that you've discussed, is a male. Why are there no women doing PR? If Israel's public image is one of this militaristic, violent country of these rampaging soldiers, why don't you have well-spoken, well-groomed, elegant women, as the Palestinians do? You notice these extraordinary young women they use who are Americans, who speak with American accents. That's number one. Number two, how do you stop dead in their tracks someone like this woman? And my own theory now, more and more, is one I sympathize with and understand, all the grassroots movements. It's got to be taken onto the highest possible level. And I would take this woman to court and sue the pants off her. For defamation, anything. Just take a clever lawyer and take this woman to court. They're starting to do it now. Dershowitz is now starting to come out in defense of this. This is what I think has to be done. There's no other way to stop them.
Okay, I'm not quite sure there's a question there, but on the first point I certainly agree with you that there should be more women and also variety of people, different backgrounds, different ages and so on, and definitely we're living in a televisual age. There is a fundamental, well, you could widen it out and say Israel is too patriarchal a society in general. It's not, the spokespeople are merely a product of the overall society. But certainly about spokespeople, it's more than just having women. First of all, you need people who speak languages properly without accents. Secondly, you need people that really know their countries. So there are enough immigrants, Israelis, immigrants from other countries. There should not be a spokesperson in the embassy in Paris who was not someone who grew up in France, who knows exactly the nuances and details between, France 2 and France 5, and which programs which. Or let's take the BBC, since I'm from Britain. The BBC, just in Britain, has 4 main ordinary television stations. It has BBC 24, which is a news station. It has 6 radio stations. This is just domestically. Each station has different programs, different presenters. They're independent, autonomous a lot. So I have to know exactly what makes, let's say, Jeremy Paxman tick before I give an interview to him. This is something acquired over years of knowledge, not just about the media, but culturally about the different cultures. So for sure, it would be good to have women, younger people, good-looking people, because it helps. But it's not just that. You need people who really know their stuff. And again, other countries, it's not like other countries have magnificent public relations, but they can get away with it. Israel can't get away with it. Israel needs top-notch people. In your second point about legal actions, I'm not a lawyer. My own feelings are, my own feelings are mixed about using the law. Because it can be counterproductive. I'm not saying Israel shouldn't use the law, but it has to be done very carefully and sparingly, and not play into hands and not give too much attention to someone who, sometimes it's better to not to give the oxygen of publicity to someone who wants it and make her a martyr, and you have to be very careful with doing that. But certainly the people in charge of PR should be more aware of who they're dealing with, and it's a thorny issue. This is a free society. I'm not advocating not allowing free speech, but for example, Robert Fisk, who you probably heard of, he was at the Herzliya conference last week, sitting there as a guest, with Israeli government credentials, writing stuff which is just appalling. What to do? Do you not allow him into the country? Maybe in a really extreme case, there might be an argument to not allow some journalists into the country, but it can be very counterproductive as well if Israel is seen as trying to stifle free speech. So I'm not sure about that. Okay, next.
Wait, can I add something to that?
No,
the way I understand it in America, you can't
make remarks in between. The next one is Alma.
Yes. First of all, thank you for this very thoughtful and illuminating presentation. I've learned quite a bit from it. I'm interested in the reasons why these very gross distortions. It's not meant to be a pun. I'm serious. These very gross distortions of what Israel is like are so widespread and are so accepted by people in Europe, for example, on the left of the political wing and other parts of the political wing, and sometimes on the extreme right even. There is a colleague of yours, a very well-known one, Thomas Friedman, who wrote a book some years ago called From Beirut to Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. And in that book he pointed out that the Christian world is preoccupied with Israel in a kind of an ambivalent way. In other words, on the one hand, they think of the Jews in Israel in some ways as hostile to Christianity, those who crucified Jesus Christ and so on. On the other hand, Israel is a very special country to them in that Christianity was born here and Jesus was born here, and Israel is a very special country, and it is expected to behave on a much higher moral level than, say, the ordinary country or military and so on. So there is a kind of ambivalence, if I understand Thomas Friedman correctly, there is a kind of ambivalence on the part of the Christian world toward Israel, and so he gives an example of some Israeli soldiers who just grabbed some Palestinians some years ago during the first Intifada, and this just grabbing this man without doing him any real harm made the first page of the Boston Globe or some other newspaper. I wonder what you think of the psychological reasons of why there are such gross distortions and why they're so widespread. Thank you.
It's very complicated. There's no one reason. As I said right at the beginning, it's not Israel's fault that it's held to impossibly high standards. What Friedman or others might say is that Israel is a democracy, it's part of the West, it should be held to higher standards. Maybe so, maybe he's right, but that's not what's happening. Israel's being held to impossible standards. That's not the same thing as being held to higher standards, which maybe Israel would welcome. There are lots of reasons. My own prime reason would be nothing to do with Christianity. It would be simply that, let's say, the broader progressive left need an issue. They like going on marches, they like having boycotts and demonstrations. That issue used to be Vietnam, and then it was, nuclear disarmament in the 1980s, sort of de facto support of the Soviet Union. Then it was apartheid. And now there are two big issues that submerged. One is global warming and the other is Palestinianism. Both these issues are serious issues. The Palestinian issue is a serious issue and the Palestinians are suffering, or many of them are. Global warming is also possibly an issue. I don't know enough about it. What I can say is that the way these two issues are treated are completely exaggerated. They're treated with an almost religiosity. In fact, the only link I'd make to Christianity is it's not, in Europe, it's not an ambivalent Christian feeling, it's a post-Christian feeling in a secular Europe that doesn't have religion, trying to find substitute religions, of which the Palestinian issue appears to be one for some people. So it's not a question of... It's not rational necessarily. It's an irrational. It's not. I mean, to compare Gaza to concentration camps, not rational in the first place, even by the biggest enemies of Israel. So it's an issue. It's a trend. It's a fashion, and it is, I'm afraid to say, partly Israel's fault that it's allowed to develop over terribly mismanaged public diplomacy over decades. This has emerged, and it's harder to reverse it now. Now, my own feeling, knowing quite a lot of senior people in government and the foreign ministry, is in the last year there's a much more serious awareness of this issue because of Goldstone. When Tzipi Livni, can't go shopping in London for fear of being arrested for war crimes or whatever, it's a wake-up call. However, this is very, very late in the day because the what started out as maybe driven from the hard left is much wider now, which is why I've showed you stuff on the Daily Telegraph and the Times. These are not left-wing newspapers. So it's almost civilizational. Now, you gave an example from the Boston Globe. Almost every day there are pictures of Israelis behaving badly in major newspapers. And it's not that these pictures are necessarily untrue, it's just that they're so out of context. I mean, for example, right now, NATO forces are amassing in Helmand province in Afghanistan for it's going to be the biggest single military counterinsurgency operation since 2001. The BBC, I counted it, it was 23 minutes into their world news yesterday. There is no way, if Israel was amassing tens of thousands of troops on the Gaza border, it wouldn't be round-the-clock breaking news. So this is British troops involved, okay? Thousands and thousands of British troops, along with tens of thousands of American troops, about to go into one of Britain's biggest battles. I'm not entirely an expert, but I believe it's bigger than any battle Britain had in Iraq. So this is one of Britain's biggest battles for decades, about to happen any hour, and yet it's way down the news. So the double standards, even with other Western countries, are just astounding. Never mind the double standards with the Arab world, or with Russia or China or other countries.
Zalman?
Briefly, in the recent war in Gaza, all the three top spokespersons were women, eloquent, good-looking, So there's something wrong with your question, or your comment. I guess it was the message and not the people who actually delivered the people.
I don't recall that being the case.
Yeah, well, you don't agree, but these are facts. And it was the lady.
The IDF spokesman.
The IDF spokesman was a woman here in Jerusalem. The lady in the Prime Minister's office dealing with foreign press was a woman. And the spokesperson of the Chief of Staff during, I'm sorry, not the Gaza war, but the Lebanese war was a woman. They may not have been very good, but it's not a matter of gender. It may have been a matter of the message which they were given to deliver, and that's probably a more serious problem. But I have two real questions. Number one, in your assessment, how much fault lies with the Israeli media nourishing the foreign media, including cartoons sometimes? Number two is a completely different question. If there were an Israeli TV channel which would be seen in real time across, and there are all plans, I mean there have been plans, nothing really happened so far, would that have an impact, or would that be seen as a foreign sort of propaganda channel? Thank you.
Okay, so I'll answer your points with the three. First of all, about the women. Avital Leibovich was, you're right, on screen as the IDF spokesperson, but I believe the only other woman I know is prominent was Miri Eisen, and that was earlier. That wasn't at the same time as Avital Leibovich. And definitely the lead spokespeople were people like Danny Gillerman, who, by the way, was good, but he's obviously not a woman. And there were lots of spokespeople at different embassies, and there were lots of people doing this, and I don't want to go into detail because I know the people, but I don't believe it's the case that there were more than, the majority were definitely men. Avital Leibovich, while not bad, is not, I mean, I personally know here in Israel some very charming, able, younger women who would be televisual and brilliant, who speak several languages, who've lived in Europe, who are been in the intelligence and the army and so on, and they failed to get on the cadet course in the foreign ministry because of security reasons. And I would say, well, don't give them access to sensitive data then. Shouldn't preclude them being employed as spokespeople. And I can just feel, as someone who's been on TV quite a lot and worked in TV, and just feel that they'd be good. But because of the internal politics of the foreign ministry and so on, they're unlikely at the present time to bring in outside spokespeople. On your questions, first of all, the question about the Israeli media, specifically I would say Haaretz, because for foreigners, very few speak Hebrew. It's the English edition of Haaretz, essentially. It's not Israeli TV and so on. They're not really watching it. It's undoubtedly done quite a lot of damage. Certain journalists, certain stories and so on. No question. In addition, there are individual Israelis who may not be journalists, who are working as professors and academics and so on, in either here or in universities abroad, who make a career out of, I mean, that's why they get on TV in Britain and America. They get on TV in order to attack their own country. I mean, they wouldn't get invited to prestigious Oxford Union debates or leading BBC programs. Other than for that purpose, they're not leading Middle East experts. So undoubtedly, the, let's say, hard Israeli left do a tremendous amount of damage for Israeli public relations. Your question about a TV channel, I don't know is the answer. I suspect it wouldn't do that much help, and I imagine it's a very costly endeavour, and therefore, with a limited budget, I wouldn't recommend it, because who's going to watch it anyway? And it's not a question of, first of all, we're living in an age where television is on the wane and everything's instant messaging and Twitter and so on. You know, even email, younger people don't even use email anymore. It's too slow, it's too old. No, it's already over. It's all instant messaging and Skype and Twitter and Facebook and so on. So, and you know, these things are only 3 or 4 years old. There may be new things that I don't even know about that are starting now. So television is already an old medium to do, but even if you do, I mean, at most you're preaching the converted. What you need is you need to have good coverage on CNN or on the BBC, not on some Israeli channel which will have low ratings and only be watched by sympathetic people anyway.
Yoel?
Yes, Tom, I have two questions. You had mentioned the problem of incompetence. The Israeli media has devoted no attention to the Al-Dura affair. There has been an important feature article in the Arts by Mr. Petitzur and 2 television documentaries. Perhaps you could say a word about the Al-Dura affair and how you might think that there might still be a chance of recovering our position in this one. The second question is a professional question. What newspapers do you think an average individual should follow in order to be well informed?
Okay, so Al-Dura, I presume everybody here knows. Is anyone that needs to be told what it is? No, okay. Essentially, it's too late to do anything about it. I mean, it's already 2010, it happened in 2000, and the problem for Israel is even if the young Al-Dura boy was not killed by Israelis or not killed at all, Israel undoubtedly has killed a number of Palestinian children in the last 10 years, and therefore an opponent of Israel will go, so what? Okay, we got it wrong with, or it's not proven on that kid, but you're trying to turn attention from the fact that Israel's killed X hundred or X thousand children in the last 10 years. So I'm not sure it's very wise at this point to bring it up too much. However, certainly the lesson should be learned for any future case like that, so that the same tremendous mistakes that the State of Israel made in relation to this case are not repeated. Just in case you're not all aware, Al-Dura is more than just a poster child for the Intifada. In about at least a dozen countries, there are streets and squares named after him. He appears on the national stamp. I can't remember if it's Morocco or Somalia or somewhere. There's a whole square in Tehran named after him. Osama bin Laden mentioned Al-Dura in his first video after the September 11th attacks. When Daniel Pearl was beheaded, there was a picture of Al-Dura up. They put up behind the video showing him being beheaded. So the damage is just enormous. And I understand what happened from an Israeli point of view, and it's essentially misjudgment by Shimon Peres, who was then, I think, deputy foreign minister, or maybe was regional cooperation minister, and by Nachman Shai, who was the spokesperson. They were trying to nip in the bud what was at the time disturbances, which turned into the Second Intifada, and Peres essentially claimed responsibility and said sorry before checking the facts. And so did Nachman Shai on the day it happened, and then having essentially admitted and said sorry for this, it was very difficult for them to then rein it back in and say, wait a sec, Israel didn't kill this boy, and the whole circumstances are fishy and so on. But it is somewhat problematic. I mean, the other reason is that Charles Anderlin, the journalist from France 2, had served in the IDF spokesperson's office. He's an Israeli citizen, so if he said, as he did, that Al-Dura was was shot by the IDF, a lot of people would say, well, they knew him in the spokesperson's office, so it's a very difficult case. But my own judgment is it would be counterproductive to put too much attention on it. However, it says a lot that those private campaigners in France and elsewhere on this issue, it's only in the last year, as Joel pointed out, that there's been TV documentaries here on Channel 1 and so on, and articles in Haaretz saying, oh, well, maybe we got it wrong. I mean, great, it's 9 years later that they're realizing it's late in the day, and in general, to make the wider point, just as Israel historically has been good at military thinking outside the box and intelligence operations thinking outside the box, they have been terrible when it comes to media. They are years or decades behind the trends. Even now, the people who've woken up to this issue, I say, great, this is where you should have been in about 2000 or 2001. And, because I'm generally sympathetic to Israel, I try, I give them advice for free, but they don't listen, and I'm not trying, I wouldn't dream of giving advice on a subject that I don't know about. If someone asked me about the Kashmir conflict, I'd say I don't know enough to comment on the Kashmir conflict. So, and yet, people who have no experience in the media or foreign cultures who are in positions it's a problem of Israeli arrogance, are far too arrogant to actually want to listen to anybody that actually does know what they're talking about. And by the time they figured it out, the world moved on and they figured out where they should have been some years earlier. In answer to your second question about which newspapers, the whole news industry is changing in general, not just with foreign coverage of the Middle East. So there's much more opinion journalism, there's much more... I don't know if there are any newspapers on any subject which are entirely balanced and neutral today. So if I don't know if people even read one newspaper anymore. They read a selection of stuff that they're emailed or a selection of websites and so on. So the tradition of just getting one newspaper is not there, certainly for younger people.
What do you like?
What I like?
Yes.
I read all kinds of stuff, but I read the Hamas website as well because I want to know what's happening. So I read all kinds of stuff. It's not necessarily whether I like it or not. They're individual commentators that I think are good, but I don't necessarily want to mention them now. You have to read several sources and then make up your own mind both on news and opinion.
Okay, I have now, I have closed the list, because we never go beyond 9. I have Sybil Kaplan, Izzy Liebler, Moshe Dan, Yoni, and Avi Lera. So, Sybil?
Yes. Would you just, I have a loud voice. I don't
But you can't hear in the back.
Oh, okay. Would you comment, please, on the current brouhaha that's going on with the New York Times correspondent and the fact that his son is serving in the IDF? It seems to be the big front page issue now.
Okay, in case anybody doesn't know, Ethan Bronner is the New York Times correspondent. He's married to an Israeli. His son is 20 years old and is an Israeli citizen and has been enlisted for his regular army service, although afterwards he plans to go back to the United States. He's American-Israeli, he plans to go to study in America. And the Electronic Intifada, which is an anti-Israel website, has been pressuring the New York Times over this issue that the son of their correspondent is about to start army service. And the public editor of the New York Times on Sunday wrote a piece essentially saying that Ethan Bronner should be reassigned. It's not the public editor's job of the New York Times to suggest postings and reassignments of New York Times journalists. Bill Keller, who's the executive editor, the editor-in-chief of the New York Times, has now written a response defending Ethan Bronner, criticizing his own public editor. I believe this is the first time the executive editor of the New York Times has criticized the public editor of the New York Times at all on any issue. A few points I'd make, and in fact I wrote an article about this yesterday, which is why it's fresh in my head. First of all, the Iraq correspondent of the New York Times, I think his name's, if I remember correctly, Anthony Shahid, is an Arab American. The Iranian correspondent of the New York Times was born in Iran. The Gaza correspondent of the New York Times, who I know, I've met her, is a Palestinian. So first of all, there's nothing surprising about a correspondent, even at the New York Times and lots of other media, having some kind of links or connections to the people they're covering. So the Ethan Bronner story shouldn't be seen out of context. Secondly, what I would suggest, if they do remove Ethan Bronner, they should certainly choose another correspondent in Gaza, the Palestinian woman who writes the New York Times from Gaza, is far more impartial than Ethan Bronner. I think it's partial. Sorry. I think that it's very damaging now because either Ethan Bronner is reassigned and it doesn't look good, or he stays but is then under maybe pressure, if only in his head, to bend over backwards to show that he's not sympathetic to Israel, which in any case I think he was doing up to a point. I mean, he's generally a balanced and fair reporter compared to previous New York Times correspondents, but nevertheless he's a typical New York Times foreign correspondent, i.e., you know, someone with liberal views that's very sympathetic to the Palestinian cause and so on. So I don't think he could be described as pro-Israeli, but the perception that he's pro-Israeli, the perception that the New York Times is pro-Israeli, when in fact I would argue it's not, is very damaging to Israel. The New York Times remains the most important and influential newspaper in the world, whether you like that or not.
Thanks, Tom. I can identify and compliment you on what you've said, but I would like, if I could, to make one observation. I do think that if you look at the situation of Israeli spokesmen today and the situation as it was being the First Intifada, I think we've moved dramatically forward. There are enormous mistakes being made by politicians. There are enormous mistakes administratively that you've referred to, but I think that overall the level of spokesman of Israel is better than it's ever been that I can recollect. That doesn't mean that we can't do infinitely better, but it's much better. And I think there's a danger in our blaming the spokesman for a situation which is far more complex. The real situation is public opinion is both formed by the media and is a reflection of the media. We don't know which is which, but there's no question that in Europe, public opinion against Israel and anti-Semitism in Europe has reached such endemic and deep proportions that it's reflected in a sense whereby journalists who know what their public wants them. And I have seen, as you have seen I'm sure, many journalists who have had a particular line change that line when they go to another newspaper, because the attitude of the newspaper's editorial is their kind of ticket to the future professional advancement. And in many cases, even if they are sympathetic, and I've had many journalists that I've discussed and consulted with who I've found can come part of the way, but when they end up filing their stories, they're thinking about what's going to be tomorrow. But I'd like to take up and go a little bit further than what Zalman Shabol said, because I think it's terribly important. The role, not only of the Israeli media, but the role of Jews and Israelis in the deterioration that has taken place in the last 5 years is something that I've been writing and warning and saying is at the core. Because there was a time when you could go to an editorial leader and say to him, this is really overboard, it's anti-Semitic. But once they can turn around to you and say, one of the main newspapers in Israel says these things, and such a person from Israel says these things, it's all gone. Now, there's a thin line. You can't ask for restrictions on freedom of expression, but I think that what has happened to Israel in the last 5 years, and it's spread in the diaspora amongst diaspora Jews, has been chaos and anarchy, which has led the way forward. And I'll conclude by one remark. If you look at the Goldstone report, and if you look at the campaign that took place in the Israeli press, some time before the Goldstone report was even dreamt of, that paved the way. All those things that were subsequently proven to have been false were subsequently resurrected by a public which had picked it up from the Israeli media and absorbed it and took it for granted, even though it had been proven to be false in those times. Thank you.
Okay, I'll come here to speak about the media and about public relations, so I won't go into political points on failures of policy or politicians, and I've already mentioned that I think Haaretz does do a certain amount of damage, and I'd even say this, that the Director General of the BBC has said he doesn't want to take down the photo I showed you of the organ because it was from the Israeli media, even though, and I forgot to show this before, The Guardian has apologized for running a similar story, okay? But it hasn't apologized through anything the Israeli government or foreign ministry did. I won't go into the details of how this apology came about, but it's certainly not because of good spokespeople. the point is, the Directorate General of the BBC, aware of the photo, aware of the Guardian's apology, is refusing to apologise or take down the photo on the basis that he thinks the Israeli media have reported something similar, although in fact the Israeli media never reported that big live organs were taken and so on. So yes, the Israeli media is problematic. About your first point about spokespeople, difficult to judge. Maybe they are better, but they're not nearly good enough. And it's not a question of... for example, it's not a question of just speaking English. Mark Regev, who's Almond Chaval maybe didn't recollect, is not a woman and is the main spokesperson. Of course he can speak English. He grew up in Australia, like yourself. But, look, he's good for certain kinds of interview, but he's not good for other kinds of more combative interview. So, in the end, television is all about ratings. So David Bar-Ilan, who was Netanyahu's spokesperson, who had been editor of the Jerusalem Post, and what had a serious background in the media, they couldn't get enough of him. He told me he couldn't do all the interviews he was requested to do by often hostile media because he's just good TV. It's not that they agree with him. Mark Regev is not good TV, in my opinion. Some people think he's great. He's okay. I mean, he speaks English, but he has no back. No, he's okay. He's more than that. He has some experience. He's been doing it for some years. That's why Netanyahu kept him on after Olmert, and he was in the Washington embassy before. So I don't mean to be too unfair, and it's a very difficult job that he has. Nevertheless, he may be right for a certain kind of interviewer, but not right for another kind of interviewer. And the country has to be much more nuanced in different situations, and maybe different spokespeople for different situations. Okay.
Thank you, Tom. I wondered, you're a British citizen, is that right? I assume. BBC is a government-supported $1 billion, whatever, £1 billion company, public company. I wonder, has there been any question about what they're doing in Parliament? And to follow up on what you said in the beginning about your contacts within British society, why have they been silent? Especially...
Why is what, sorry?
Why have they been silent?
Who's
about
they?
British society? Especially, I would ask you about Jewish society. Certainly the chief rabbi. Why has there been no public outcry, at least in the Jewish community, about what their state-supported media is doing?
Okay, I tell you, because we've got limited time, because I have
one real, just quick question is, do you see any, to follow on Izzy's point, do you see any change today in what's going on? That's all.
Change in which way?
Is it better with the new administration?
So the new administration where?
Here.
Okay. Okay, I'm not going to get into political or societal questions about Britain. About the BBC, though, I'll speak about the media. About the BBC, maybe you're not aware, there's tremendous criticism of the BBC on hundreds of issues, not on Israel. I mean, Israel's fairly peripheral. There are lots of campaigns to scrap the license fee which funds it, to privatise the BBC and so on all kinds of issues. The BBC is a very powerful institution. They, in effect, hounded Tony Blair out of office. I mean, Tony Blair had just won another election, had a big majority in Parliament, and he resigned a year or two into a 5-year term, which is still going on, the term that he was elected for, after non-stop, persistent criticism by the BBC on Iraq and other matters. So ultimately, no party, including the Conservatives, which the Conservatives are in opposition and are predicted to win the elections there in April or May this year, I doubt whether they'll do anything. The BBC is too powerful an institution for politicians to take on in Britain. There are private groups like the Taxpayers Alliance who have no connection with Israel but cite funding of Palestinian TV and education and the BBC coverage of it as not being helpful to British interests. And the BBC has become the kind of television version of The Guardian. It only recruits people through The Guardian, that's where it advertises for jobs, and it's not an objective news service, and under British law there's a charter. It's a corporation, the BBC, and there's a BBC charter. It's under legal obligation to be balanced. It's not just a question of being nice. Other newspapers can do what they like. They're private newspapers. The BBC is under a legal obligation to be balanced, yet no one will really tackle them because they're too powerful.
Parliament?
Sorry?
Parliament?
No, I mean, I just said they brought down a sitting Prime Minister.
Good morning, I'll stand for ease of sight. My name is Yoni, I'm an intern here at the JCPA. Firstly, thank you for the talk you've given. It's actually painfully frustrating for a trilingual Israeli like myself who's trying to find work in the Army spokesperson's office who's being denied such on security grounds. My question is on Haiti. A caveat first is that many Israelis think that Haiti went a lot better for us than people abroad will. There was a lot of speculation of how much Haiti and Israel's work in Haiti was on Fox and CNN, and it was all over Israel. So if you were in America or in Britain at the time, the actual coverage was very small. That being said, it was something positive. What went right with Haiti, and how can that be repeated?
I mean, let's hope it's not repeated.
I don't
It's a different story. It's a different story. I mean, it's a one-off story where Israel's good at what it does in disaster relief and got some good reporting out of it. But first of all, you shouldn't, like you pointed out, you're correct, you shouldn't exaggerate. There was round-the-clock coverage of Haiti, and of course it's easy to pick out the 3-minute segments on Israel and send them out on YouTube to your friends. That doesn't mean the average viewer is going to be tuning into that. But in any case, look, a lot of people are here in the foreign ministry and so on have all kinds of ideas about rebranding Israel and away from the conflict and beyond the conflict. You can't ignore the conflict. I mean, fine, you can say come here for a nice vacation and there's nice beaches and historical sites, but ultimately the state of Israel has to tackle what's being accused of, which is not wanting peace and, stealing Palestinian land or chopping down olive trees, whatever it is, and it has to find the right tools to deal with that, and it has to have the right spokespeople to deal with that.
Last question, Avi Lehrer. Could you give us your opinion on the value of pro-Israel Hasbara groups such as NGO Monitor or the British Israel group or Take a Pen?
Well, I mean, these groups are, look, the situation would be much, much worse without these groups. These groups are doing the job to a large extent, or some of these groups are doing the job that should be done by the state in different ways. So there are a number of private groups, some of them are better, some of them are worse, one or two are even counterproductive. But in general, they do good work in terms of public relations for Israel, and they also maybe make some Israeli diplomats a little lazy because, somebody else is doing the job for them. But it's a supplemental thing. In the end, there's one government, there's one embassy in each country, there's one spokesperson, and the BBC wants to put an ambassador on, it doesn't want some private pressure group. I forgot to answer Moshe Dan's other question about whether this government's doing better. I don't think so. I mean, in fact, Netanyahu's barely giving interviews, and as somebody said the other day, he is his own best spokesperson. So, from a PR point of view, he should probably give more interviews.
Thank you so much.